They were told that victory would come from above, that strategic bombardments, high-altitude raids, and precision strikes would cripple the Japanese war machine from a safe distance, that the air power of the United States was too evolved, too dignified, too rational for gut fighting in the tropics. But in the sweltering jungles of the Southwest Pacific, where maps turned to mud and carriers couldn't reach, it wasn't altitude that mattered. It was proximity, firepower, fury. And in that unforgiving theater, it wasn't the generals or their doctrines that turned the tide. It was a wiry, irascible man named Pappy Gunn, who ignored what they were told and instead turned battered B-25 bombers into low-flying monsters bristling with unheard-of fire. To the men who first saw what Gunn had done to those planes, their minds could not reconcile what they were looking at. They had been taught that the B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber good at making neat patterns in the sky, dropping bombs in tidy geometries. They had trained for that. Angles, altitudes, symmetry. But here, on the ragged shores of New Guinea and under the explosive heat of a sun that never blinked, those same aircraft thundered in at treetop height, not to drop bombs from the heavens, but to flay the earth itself with 50 caliber machine guns, 16 or more barrels stitched along their noses and bellies like the snarl of a steel beast. It wasn't elegance, it was slaughter. And for the first time in the war, the Japanese began to look over their shoulders at the sky, not in fear of distant bombers, but in terror of what now hunted them face to face. Pappy Gunn wasn't supposed to be here, not in this war, not in this jungle, not at this stage in life. He was 45 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, a former naval aviator turned civilian airline mechanic in the Philippines. He had a wife, 4 kids, and the slow, steady life of a man who had once flown but now helped others fly. They told him his war was already over, but it wasn't. When the Philippines fell and his family was captured by the Japanese, the war became personal. Mechanic turned maverick. Pilots said Gunn had oil in his veins and anger in his bones. He didn't obey headquarters. He made his own. At night, the jungle sweated. Canvas tents buzzed with insects that no book had named. The smell of mildew and hot rubber choked the interiors of makeshift hangars, and the air tasted of rusting aluminum and spoiled petrol. In these crude workshops that were more like warlock labs, Gunn took wrecked, discarded B-25 seconds, and reshaped them like a man pulling snarling dogs from scrap. He tore out their noses, the domes that once held bomb sights and glass, and replaced them with solid, riveted steel. Into these noses, he crammed machine guns with maniacal precision. It began with 4 guns, then 6, 8, 12. In some cases, up to 16. They pointed forward like sharpened tusks, like wrath. Official doctrine said it was madness. But the field crews watched, the pilots watched, and something in them shifted. It wasn't just that Gunn's mods worked, it was that they spoke to something buried, unsanctioned, and desperate in every man who had seen his friends die on jungle trails and in mosquito-bitten foxholes for towns no one back home could pronounce. Doctrine didn't work here. Discipline didn't scare the Japanese. But the roar of a retooled B-25 screeching down to sea level, dragging death across the decks of enemy shipping that worked, that filled decks with bodies and waters with burning fuel, that sent the enemy scattering into the jungle themselves. The first time they used one of Gunn's creatures against a Japanese convoy, the pilots didn't know what to expect. The plan called for a low-level attack against ships nestled into a narrow channel, timing, terrain, and trajectory all tight enough to make a coffin seem roomy. It was a trial by fire, not science, not symmetry. As the reconfigured B-25 seconds roared over the water, their pilots felt the vibration not through their instruments, but in their bones. The 16 forward-firing machine guns unleashed a horizontal torrent, tearing across wooden decks and into munitions holds. Gunners on the enemy freighters barely had time to flinch. Some ships exploded instantly. Others limped until they burned out on reef or rock. The pilots didn't speak much after landing. There was no need. The results spoke in smoke. But it wasn't just the guns that changed. It was the mindset. They had been taught to fly above the clouds, to be angels of calculated demolition. But here, they were dragons. The airframes trembled with strain not designed into the specs. Engines overheated, wings groaned. But the crews no longer feared gravity. They feared irrelevance, and they loved those planes like men love dogs gone half-feral, dangerous, loyal, essential. In mess tents that reeked of evaporated rations and the sour sweat of too many bodies, they joked quietly about the mods they wanted next. Could a B-25 carry a torpedo? Could it skim the ocean like a skipping stone? The engineers rolled their eyes, but the mechanics didn't laugh. They knew Pappy was listening. Always listening. He walked the perimeter at night, among the wrecks and hulks, drawing diagrams in the dirt with a length of wire. They said he slept 3 hours at a time, that he could take a bullet-riddled bomber and have it rearmed and reborn by morning. When the Battle of the Bismarck Sea came in March of 1943, the contradiction became doctrine. The top brass still didn't trust it, this strafer strategy, this madman's modification. But the Japanese convoy steaming toward Leh was too tempting a target, and the old ways hadn't worked, so they let the monsters fly. The morning air was cool for once, but the sea below steamed like freshly drawn blood. 30-plus ships packed with soldiers, equipment, and food. A logistical artery deep in enemy waters. The B-25 seconds came low, too low to track with radar. And from miles out, the gunners aboard the Japanese vessels recognized too late that these were not the high flyers they had trained for. These were predators. The noise, survivors would later say, was like the sky cracking open. The forward guns didn't simply spray, they carved. Into decks, into steel, into flesh. Pilots flew so low that salt spray clung to the glass of their cockpits. One described the smell as a mix of cordite, brine, and the strange sweetness of burning paint. The B-25 seconds ripped through the convoy again and again, their side gunners catching lifeboats as they fell, their bellies dropping bombs into ruptured hulls. By the time it was over, the sea rolled black and orange. More than 3,000 Japanese troops had died. 8 transports and 4 destroyers had vanished beneath the water. And what remained of the convoy limped into the tree line, leaving a trail of oil like a bleeding artery. The brass called it innovation. The pilots called it justice. Pappy Gunn didn't attend the debriefing. He was back in the hangars, sleeves rolled, eyes scanning the next set of tired airframes he could twist into thunder. But war isn't cinematics, and it isn't clean. There were pilots who came back with blood still warm on their boots, not all of it their own. Waist gunners who stopped sleeping. Radar operators who stopped speaking. They had wanted revenge. They had gotten it. Now what? In a quiet moment, one pilot just 21 years old sat on the edge of the runway, chewing at canned peaches with his fingers. He watched the sun rise copper over wreckage and jungle, and the sugar from the fruit stuck to his fingers like sap. He didn't look at the planes. He looked at the sky and wondered if it would be better not to return. Elsewhere, a mechanic kept sanding a single wing even though the job had already passed inspection. His hands moved from reflex, not logic. He didn't know if the war was winnable or if the mods were sustainable. But he knew Pappy had asked him to prep the next one. And he knew the next one, too, would fly low. And back in the mud-caked edges of the airfield, Pappy himself jotted notes in a notebook stained with integration grease. How many more guns could they fit without cracking the frame? Could they reinforce the mounts? Angle the barrels differently for shorter run-ups? A lessening of recoil? He wasn't a warlord. He was a father who had lost his family to war and could only talk to engines now. His grief had metal teeth, and it tore into ships one burst at a time. It was not the power of the modification that changed the war, but the desperation that created it. It was not the steel that broke the enemy, but the willingness to unlearn the rules and remake the tools. And beneath the myth of the 14-gun B-25 seconds lay a simple truth, one man's refusal to accept that the war could not be fought on different terms. When the war ended, the official histories cited doctrine and supply lines. They praised strategy and command chains. But in the hangars, among the rusted wrecks and spent shell casings, The men knew something else had moved the needle. Not rank, not rules, but rage turned to craft. Loss turned to flight. They flew not for glory, but because someone made them believe a bomber could be something more than a bomber, that a machine could be transformed like grief itself into raw, unrelenting purpose. Years later, one surviving pilot returned to that same jungle strip, swallowed now by ferns and rot, and laid a hand on the twisted belly of what might have once been his aircraft. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The vines had made peace with the metal. The earth had reclaimed what it could not bear to remember. But he did. He remembered every sound, every lurch, every scream through the headset when the front guns opened fire. And he remembered Pappy, the man who saw a bomber and asked, but what else could it be? There was nothing elegant in those monsters of the air. Only a brutal, undeniable beauty. And for a brief, terrible moment in history, they spoke louder than doctrines, fiercer than flags. And there were thousands more stories like this waiting to be remembered.